Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Relationship-Based Care Practice webinar series. Today's topic is culturally responsive care. I'm Tina Jimenez with the State Capacity Building Center's Infant Toddler Specialist Network. The State Capacity Building Center is a service of the Office of Child Care. The Infant Toddler Specialist Network supports states, territories, and tribes to enhance the quality of infant toddler care in early education settings. Before we get started today, I'd like to ask my colleagues and co-presenters to introduce themselves.
Hello, everyone. I'm Julie Law, and I'm excited to be here with you today.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rana Schaefer, and I'm delighted to be here to talk about this really important topic of culturally responsive care.
Thank you. Now, in staying with tradition, we invite you to make yourself comfortable and get ready to explore this session on culturally responsive care. This webinar series was designed to increase your understanding of how the PITC's relationship-based care framework, the pyramid model, and the third edition of the environment rating scales can work together to support and measure high-quality care for infants and toddlers. Culturally responsive care is one of 6 relationship-based care practices that work together to set the stage for meaningful relationships between infants and their caregivers and children's families. Here are the goals for today's webinar. You'll identify the role of culture in infant-toddler development. You'll reflect on why culturally responsive care is important for infants and toddlers. You'll acquire strategies to support the implementation of culturally responsive care, and you'll explore the connection between culturally responsive practices, the pyramid model, and the environment rating scales. We recommend that you allow 60 to 90 minutes to view the webinar and to complete the associated learning experiences. Click on the handout icon below to download 3 items: the Culturally Responsive Care Worksheet, the Culturally Responsive Care Rationale paper, and the PowerPoint for this training. Don't forget to have your ITERS 3 or your FECRS 3 assessment booklets available. We just want to remind you that all of the learning experiences within this webinar will be completed using the fillable worksheet. When you click on the handout icon at the bottom of the screen, you'll find links to additional resources which can be used to deepen your understanding of the content within this webinar. Please pause the webinar here to gather your materials and then resume the webinar when you're ready. Let's explore the role of culture in infant-toddler development to consider why it's important. Culture is a complex topic. When you train caregivers, it's important to ensure that they have a basic understanding of culture before they consider how they can provide care that is culturally responsive to infants and toddlers. Culture encompasses the values, beliefs, linguistics, patterns of thinking, self-expression, and styles of communication that shape our behaviors, expectations, and reactions. Culture goes beyond race and color to include ethnicity, physical characteristics, and groups with similar values. Culture can be expressed through parenting styles and interactions with children, including expectations for behavior and beliefs about what children need. For example, one family may feel that older siblings are responsible for caring for and protecting their younger siblings, while another family sees this role solely as the responsibility of the adult. You might have a strong opinion about this depending on your personal experience. The feelings that come up around an example like the one that I shared are grounded in our cultural beliefs and values and are dependent on who you are and where you come from. This pyramid model slide identifies 2 important concepts about culture and infant-toddler behavior. Concept number 1, individual and culturally based beliefs, values, and perceptions affect caregivers' attitudes about children's behavior. Our expectation for children's behavior can differ based on our personal experience and the cultural group that we identify with. The second concept shared on this slide is that infants and toddlers don't come to group care knowing what behaviors are appropriate in group care settings. Caregivers must learn about the cultural expectations of the families that they serve and support children through culturally responsive interactions. Let's look at the next slide to identify some differences in cultural expectations. This slide's also from the pyramid model. It highlights the research findings on how developmental expectations can vary by cultural group. This research looks at expectations for attaining developmental milestones among Caucasian, Puerto Rican, and Filipino families. The asterisk denotes statistically significant differences in cultural beliefs about children's development. So I'd like to call your attention to the row that addresses when children are expected to sleep by themselves. In the Caucasian culture, children were expected to sleep by themselves at 13.8 months of age. In Puerto Rican cultures, children were expected to sleep alone by 14.6 months of age. However, in the Filipino culture, a child is not expected to sleep alone until 38.8 months of age. So we know that not all Caucasian, Puerto Rican, and Filipino families share these beliefs about age level expectations. There's a great deal of variation within each cultural group. This study demonstrates how in certain areas across different ethnic groups, there can be very different developmental expectations for children based on individual cultures. Let's consider another example to consider why this information is important. Look at the utensils category. In this study, Caucasian families expected children to start using utensils at around 17.7 months of age. Puerto Rican families expected toddlers to use utensils at 26.5 months of age, and Filipino families expected toddlers to start using utensils at around 32.4 months of age. As a professional development specialist, you may work with a program or with a caregiver that has expectations about when a child should begin feeding himself. If they value independence, their expectations for when children should begin using utensils to feed themselves may be quite different from the family's expectation for this behavior. You can help caregivers to understand that there are many right ways to raise children and that their expectations for children's behavior may differ from the expectations of children's families. This recognition can provide a strong foundation for providing culturally responsive care. This quote by Carol Brunson Day reminds us of the significance of culture in child care settings serving infants and toddlers. There is almost nothing that a person can do while interacting with a child under age 3 that is not cultural. Everything that one does is cultural. Just take a minute to reflect on those words. Families trust their caregivers to help raise their child in a way that honors and respects and values their culture. Now I'm going to turn it over to Rana to talk more about this.
Thank you, Tina. Tina helped us focus on why culture is so important for healthy social and emotional development. Now let's look more deeply at this concept and explore the importance of culturally responsive care for infants and toddlers. Take a look at the definition of culturally responsive care. Culturally responsive care is the practice of caring for children from culturally diverse families in ways that are consistent with their home practices and values. Traditionally, the child's family and cultural community have been solely responsible for the transmission of values, expectations, and ways of doing things, especially during the early years of life. But in today's world, children enter childcare during those tender years of infancy. Their cultural identity and sense of belonging in their own families are influenced by their experience in care. Consistency of care between home and the child care environment, always important for the very young, becomes even more so when the infant or toddler is cared for in the context of cultural practices different from those of the child's family. Now it's time for your first learning experience for today. Pause the webinar and think about the question on the worksheet for slide 13. Reflect on why you feel culturally responsive care is important for infants and toddlers. What are the benefits? What are the challenges? When you are done with the worksheet, resume the webinar. I hope you were able to list several benefits and even some challenges to providing culturally responsive care. You may have recognized these points. When child care connects with the child's family and experiences at home, this supports the child's developing sense of who they are within their home culture. Conversely, when a child care program contradicts or devalues a child's home language and home culture, this can be confusing and even painful for the child and their family. Culturally consistent care between home life and child care, including home language, supports healthy development for infants and toddlers. Culturally responsive care respects infants and toddlers' ways of communicating and supports their language development. As we mentioned in the first webinar on social emotional development, if you can remember back to that webinar, children are developing a sense of self during the first 3 years, and their culture is a large part of that identity. When we practice culturally responsive care, we strengthen their understanding that they are unique and valued. When we honor their family's language, values, and ways of doing things, we promote this positive self-identity. We know that culture is a fundamental building block in the development of a child's identity. The cultural context shapes social interactions in the family. This is where infants begin to see themselves as part of something. Through cultural learning, children gain a feeling of belonging, a sense of personal history, and a security of knowing where they come from. Infants and toddlers are at the initial stage of developing a sense of self and are particularly vulnerable to messages about their emerging cultural identity. When infants and toddlers enter childcare, the cultural context differs from their family experience. Childcare providers have a responsibility to create some continuity between the family and the childcare experiences to support each child's positive sense of self. But challenges can occur when our perspective differs from that of the family. Julie will talk a bit later about navigating these cultural bumps. An important part of being culturally responsive is in our interactions with infants and toddlers begins with cultural sensitivity. Cultural sensitivity is an ongoing awareness of our own and others' cultural context. It's an ongoing willingness to see the world from many different and equally valid perspectives. Cultural sensitivity begins with an awareness of our own culture, the cultural context of others, and how we were influenced by our early experiences. Cultural sensitivity includes a commitment to understand and support the values, practices, and attitudes of other people. Caregivers can commit to this through engaging in a reflective process and developing tools to understand their own and their family's perspective, work through challenges, and understand differences if they arise. We encourage you to take the time to view this powerful video when you can. Douglas Quiet reminds us that becoming culturally sensitive and culturally responsive is a process. We are never truly done. As we move from culturally sensitive, which is an awareness of our own and others' cultural influences, to culturally responsive care, we need to remember that culturally responsive care is a practice of caring for children from culturally diverse families in ways that are consistent with their home practices and values. There are many ways we can make our care culturally consistent with families. We provide infants and toddlers with consistent experiences bringing the familiarity of home into care by singing a song that mom sings at nap time, patting a child's back in a similar way to how grandpa does it, serving familiar foods when you can, or listening to familiar music. We initiate respectful and open conversations with families by asking questions, talking about what happened during care, getting familiar with each other, and finding out what matters to the family, as well as encouraging them to ask questions if they're unsure about anything. We need to make a continuous effort to create continuity between a family's home and care setting by learning words and phrases in the family's home language if it's different from our own language. Explain to families that we want to bring little pieces of home and family into their child's time with you at care to help them feel connected to their families, even when they are apart. And by asking, what is something I could do or say that would remind your child of you and your home? A culturally responding learning environment promotes continuity between children's home and their early learning setting. Dual language learning fosters children's sense of belonging, social connectedness, and emotional attachment. I'm sure you can think of many examples of this, but here are just a couple. A child whose father was a plumber brought some scrap PVC tubes and mounted them to the fence in the play yard at different angles. The toddlers observed Austin's father install the tubes with great interest, and then they dropped balls, cars, sand, and other things through the tubes. These were always remembered as Austin's dad's tubes. Another example, Erica's grandmother is often humming when she brings Erica to Chelsea's family childcare home. Chelsea asks her about the songs and learns they are hymns from their church. Chelsea begins to hum when she holds Erica for a bottle or settles her down to sleep. Erica seems to relax and enjoy this familiar experience, even though Erica's voice is quite different from her grandmother's. Now I will turn it over to Julie to explore specific strategies caregivers can use to support culturally responsive care for infants and toddlers.
Thank you, Rana. Let's explore some practices for culturally responsive care, including building relationships with families and developing skills to negotiate cultural bumps. Rana shared with us how culturally consistent care supports identity development in infants and toddlers. And finally, we will look at providing care that is culturally consistent with the child's experience at home. We know that relationships infants and toddlers have with their families are essential to their social emotional well-being. Let's take a moment to reflect on caregiver-family relationships. Pause the webinar and complete the learning experience for slide 23 in your worksheet. When you have finished, resume the webinar. Now let's look at strategies for nurturing relationships with families. In your reflection, you may have written down the importance of communicating daily with families about the routines and experiences at home and in care. Here are some other strategies that can help us provide care that is culturally responsive to children and their families. Having an area that welcomes families and space for nursing mothers to feel comfortable is important to families feeling like they belong. Connecting with families in meaningful ways allows you to develop sensitive routines at drop-off and pickup that meet the needs of the child and the family. Asking families how they like to communicate and making an effort to communicate in the family's home language is helpful in supporting home language development and maintaining strong relationships. Including pictures of families or items from their home in the care environment provides a sense of community and belonging. Creating a picture board of laminated photos with Velcro backing at a level where the infants and toddlers can see and access. Arranging family photo books in a basket next to a cozy space to explore them, or perhaps a photo matching game for toddlers are some strategies that connect family and home memories in the care setting. We know talking to children about their families throughout the day is an important way to connect meaningful experiences the families may have shared with you to the child's time away from home. Including families in daily routine conversations, such as when getting ready to go outside, a caregiver might share, "Your papa said you like to put your shoes on at home. I wonder if you want to put your shoes on now." Or, "I know your mommy packed this lunch for you. She knows how much you like carrots. I wonder what she is eating for lunch." Young children feel secure, supported, and happy when they see the important adults in their lives connecting with each other in positive ways. However, sometimes we may find these are bumps in the road as we work to relate with families in culturally responsive ways. Cultural bumps refer to the misunderstandings that can result when families and caregivers have different ways of doing things based on their different cultural perspectives. Most of us have experienced a time when something we did or said was misunderstood, or at least the outcome did not reflect our intentions. In many cases, this can be a moment when people's cultural perspectives bump up against each other. For instance, maybe you come from a family where you make comments and talk to each other while watching a TV show. One day you watch a show with a new friend's family, and they are silent during the show. Your good-natured comments about the actors and plot may not be welcomed. On the other hand, maybe you come from a family where there's a lot of talking and you jump into conversation where you can, so voices are overlapping at points. You have a new roommate who waits quietly for you to finish before speaking, and you're accustomed to being interrupted. You may end up unintentionally dominating the conversation or wonder why your roommate doesn't participate much in your conversations. Let's think about how this might apply to a childcare setting where everyone wants what is best for children, yet adults may hold different ideas of what is best for children, and how they go about providing that may look quite different. Cultural bumps do not always lead to conflict, especially when people develop skills to negotiate bumps as they arise. When handled skillfully, cultural bumps can in fact lead to greater understanding of one another. Think of a time when you were supporting a caregiver who had a misunderstanding with a family. Reflect on whether that misunderstanding might have stemmed from a difference in cultural perspective about how to care for children. Take a moment to jot down some ideas on your worksheet in the training notes section. Pause the webinar if you need, then resume when you are ready. Thank you for taking time to reflect on this. Let's look at a strategy for resolving cultural bumps when they arise. This PITC approach, called Acknowledge, Ask, and Adapt, can help care providers and families find ways to manage cultural bumps. Learning to use this approach takes time and patience. Providers will always have something new to learn about themselves, their colleagues, and the families they serve. In the first step, Acknowledge, we work to recognize that cultural differences are real and meaningful, and need further investigation when a specific issue arises. It is important to take time with this step. Then we ask about the family's viewpoint without making assumptions. The goal here is to get the information necessary to eventually do collaborative problem solving with the family. Finally, we adapt by using the information gathered in the Acknowledge and Ask steps about oneself, the family, and the early childhood education field. The goal is always to find the most effective way to support each child's optimal growth, taking into account the cultural issues. This process is ongoing, dynamic, and includes mutually respectful interactions. In this approach, we use problem-solving strategies to create collaborative solutions that reflect both caregiver and family ideas and practices. You can read more about this approach in the PITC Guide to Culturally Sensitive Care, 2nd edition, Chapter 6, found in the handout icon. Now that we have explored the PITC approach, Acknowledge, Ask, Adapt, please pause the webinar and revisit the learning experience for slide 23 and add strategies for helping caregivers address the challenges they may experience when connecting with families. Let's look at an activity to practice this approach. Here's an activity from the pyramid model you could do with caregivers to practice or think about Acknowledge, Ask, Adapt. Let's think about a situation where, according to your cultural family beliefs and values, toddlers should complete potty learning by 32 months. The family of a young child you care for expects their child to complete potty learning at 20 months. What can you do to best understand and support this child and family? As a trainer, you might use this scenario to help caregivers think of strategies for communicating and understanding the family to best support the child's experiences and care. Let's look at some additional strategies you can use to support culturally responsive care. These come from the pyramid model. You will notice we discuss similar strategies from the relationship-based care framework. Visit families' homes and communities. Support children's home languages. Receive training in cultural competency. Share picture books where children in the stories come from around the world or diverse cultures. Ask families to share a special lullaby or song from their culture. Now, I will turn it over to Tina to look at how the environment rating scales connect to culturally responsive care.
Thank you, Julie and Rana, for sharing that information. In this section, we're going to look at some of the items and indicators in the ITERS 3 and the FECRS 3 that can be used to support culturally responsive care. I do want to point out that the ITERS 3 and the FECRS 3 do not specifically label caregiver practices as culturally responsive. However, the assessments do provide professional development specialists the opportunity to think together with caregivers about how they can incorporate children's culture into the child care environment, child-caregiver interactions, and caregiving routines. Let's think about how children's family and culture can be incorporated into the child care environment. In the space and furnishings subscale, item 4, display for children, indicator 7.1 requires that photographs of children in the group, their families, pets, or other familiar faces are displayed at children's eye level. And indicator 7.3 requires that staff talk about the displayed materials to children. As Julie mentioned earlier, these displays are meaningful to children, and they provide a connection between a child's home and the child care program. When children see their families represented in the child care environment, they feel a sense of belonging. When caregivers talk to individual children about their family and their community, they're supporting and honoring each child's cultural identity. Routines offer caregivers an opportunity to provide cultural continuity for infants and toddlers. In the personal care routines subscale, item 5, meals and snacks, specifies that caregiver interaction should be personalized and responsive to individual children during mealtime or feeding routines. ITERS indicator 7.4 also specifies that staff should actively teach self-help skills as children are ready. So as we mentioned earlier in this webinar, self-help skills such as feeding and using utensils may vary by culture. Caregivers can be encouraged to partner with children's families to learn about the family's goals for independence and self-feeding. Culturally consistent care honors a child's cultural identity and promotes feelings of security and belonging. ITERS item 6, diapering and toileting, provides another opportunity for caregivers to partner with families to provide cultural continuity. Conversation with the child's family can help a caregiver learn how the parent or family feels about self-help skills, which will inform how the caregiver carries out routines such as diapering or toilet learning. Caregivers can also discuss toilet learning goals with families and partner with the family to create a toilet learning plan. ITER's item 29 and FECR's item 28 are about providing physical warmth and touch. In previous webinars, we've shared that touch should be individualized and adapted to support the temperament tendencies and preferences of each child. Now let's think about touch from a cultural perspective. We've talked a lot about the benefits of providing care for infants and toddlers that is culturally consistent. But in order for caregivers to be able to do this, they must talk with children's families to deepen their own understanding about a child's preferences and to discover what the child is accustomed to. Babies come to expect that they will be cared for in a certain way based on their experience. Even the simplest caregiving routine can be done in many different ways. For example, think about the act of burping an infant after bottle feeding. Some families may pat the infant on the back while holding the infant in an upright position over the left shoulder. Some families may hold the infant over their right shoulder. And some families may lay the infant across their knees to burp the child. Some families may rub the infant's back, while others pat the infant's back. Caregivers can ask the parent or the family member to demonstrate how they conduct a routine, such as burping, and then adapt their practice to be consistent with what the child has come to expect. We hope that this section has prompted your thinking about how the ITERS 3 and the FECRS 3 can inspire conversations that can help caregivers to provide culturally responsive care. We know that we have not identified all opportunities that the environment rating scales provide for reflecting on how caregivers can provide culturally responsive care. You might want to review other sections of the subscales to find more examples of this. For example, you might want to look at the language and books subscale to reflect on additional items that provide an opportunity to provide cultural responsiveness. Recall earlier in this webinar, Rana shared research showing that dual language learning fosters children's sense of belonging and security and helps them to feel connected. Honoring a child's family and their home language is an important part of providing care that's culturally responsive. Now it's time to reflect on the content that was shared today and complete the final learning experience. In the learning experience for slide 36, we ask you to reflect on why culturally responsive care is important for infants and toddlers. We ask you to identify 2 strategies that you would share with caregivers to support culturally responsive care, and to consider how the relationship-based care framework and the pyramid model support culturally responsive care. Finally, we encourage you to reflect on how the ITERS 3 or the FECRS 3 can be used to help infant-toddler caregivers provide culturally consistent care for infants and toddlers. Please pause the webinar now to complete the learning experience for slide 36 and then resume the webinar for our wrap-up. Welcome back and congratulations! You've completed the final webinar in the Relationship-Based Care Practices webinar series. We hope that this series has deepened your understanding of relationship-based care and has enhanced your capacity to support the implementation of the PITC 6 program practices. On behalf of the State Capacity Building Center Infant Toddler Specialist Network, we want to thank you for your participation in this webinar series and for your commitment to support infant toddler caregivers and the children and families they care for. Thank you so much.